Hey everybody, this is Joanna Shoffner Scott, and you are listening to the Race in the Workplace podcast, a show for DEI organizational leaders that explores race, racism, and racial equity in the workplace. I am a racial equity consultant and founder of the Stamey Street Consulting Group, a consulting firm that specializes in partnering with organizations to help them meet their racial equity aspirations. My goal for you is to move your organization from being colorblind to equity-centered through sustainable, step-by-step changes. This week's episode of Race in the Workplace is about setting boundaries for yourself in your DEI role. If you are a DEI practitioner, it's knowing when to stay and when to go. And that's not always clear. I think setting that boundary requires thoughtful intention. All right, let's get into it. Hi, everybody. It's Joanna Shoffner Scott here. I'm so excited to be here with you today. This is my first episode of the Race in the Workplace podcast, and I'm just thrilled to be with you in this space. I want to share a little bit about why I started this podcast. So I write a blog, and I thought, what can I do with this particular space that's different than my blog? And where I landed was really about giving voice to my words and sharing examples and stories from my experience and career. And that translates a little differently than the written word. I believe there is great power in sharing our own stories. So I landed in that place and decided, okay, I'm going to do a podcast. And here I am. I invite you to join me on this journey. This week's episode is about setting boundaries for yourself in your DEI role. So if you are a DEI practitioner, it's knowing when to stay and when to go. And that's not always clear. I think that setting that kind of boundary requires a thoughtful intention. So if you are a DEI practitioner for an organization or a company, a philanthropy, or a government agency, this episode is for you. Over the course of my career, I've been in many fights. The other party may not have known we were fighting, but in my mind, we absolutely were. Sometimes I would get really revved up by the fight, really motivated. And other times it was just exhausting and made me tired. So you might be saying, Joanna, what were you fighting? What are you talking about? Why were you fighting? And as I look back over the course of my career at different points, I realized I was fighting to convince a person or people that they needed to be different in some way, that they needed to change their practices, mainly to be who they say they were. So who you are externally, so in your external programming work, should reflect who you are internally, as reflected in the experience of staff and contractors and people who do business with you. There should be an alignment there, and I feel very strongly about that. So in 2021, I learned to stop fighting. It's been a hard lesson, but an important one for my mental health and for my longevity in the work. So if it's an organization, a manager, or a team, someone I'm working with, if you are not in a space of moving toward change and accepting that making a racial equity commitment requires change, then that's not a space for me. Let me say that took me a while to get to because, as I said, I was used to the fight. So I want to share an experience of when I was working in a national nonprofit and trying to convince data analysts to disaggregate data. Disaggregating data means you're pulling it apart by race. And I remember being in this constant state at that time of convincing. I was doing workshops, I was doing training, I was doing coaching, I was doing one-on-one technical assistance calls, that kind of stuff. And I just felt like I am really having to convince people that disaggregating data is really important, and that when we don't pull our data apart, we're really hiding racialized privilege. And I remember feeling like I am in this constant state of convincing. It was incredibly exhausting as I look back. I changed some minds, but it was so hard getting there. You may be in a similar place in your own work right now where you feel like you are convincing and pulling and pushing the organization that you're working in that brought you in to do that job. And maybe the effort that you're putting in is not you're not getting the same results. Like you're not getting results that are comparable to the effort that you're putting in. So if this is you, then I want you to consider these four realities as you consider your current role and whether it's time to stick it out or pack it up. Okay? Let's start with your frustration. The frustration piece was exhausting to me, particularly when I was working with those data analysts, to be in that space over and over and over. And when I think about different moments in my career where I was in a fight, and that data analyst moment was one of them, they were mostly times where I was in an explainer role for too long. Like I'm explaining the value of something or I'm explaining the importance of it. And I'm in that explainer space for too much time, it's too long. So think about if you're in this space and you're feeling frustrated, how long have you been in that explainer place? So that's the first thing I want you to think about. The second thing I want you to think about are what other opportunities might be available to you or accessible to you, but your attention is like sort of mixed up in your current role. Okay, so fast forward to now. I learned that if I say yes to something, that means no to someone else, or no to another organization, or no to another potential client who might be ready to take more decisive steps than the situation I'm currently in. I only have one set of time. I can only work with one person at a time. I mean, not really. I've got more than one client, but you know what I mean in terms of giving that focused attention. I only have one set of time. So the roster of clients I have, like that's who I'm working with right now. So I've learned to ask myself, how do I want to spend my time? So in one sense, to stop the fight is really about refocusing on how you want to spend your time. And as my colleague always asks, what's that in service of? Is that in service of struggle with a purpose, so to be better, or to struggle with no purpose, which is spinning wheels and constantly having the same conversation and the same meeting about the same thing that you've been explaining over and over and over? So the second thing I want you to consider are the opportunity cost. What might you be missing out on? Okay, here's the third thing. I want you to really focus on yourself and think about the tension you are holding. So when you are holding that tension of basically a disconnect between internal and external organizational identities, meaning showing up in the world one way, but internally operating in a totally different way and writing a completely different story, what that means is that the public story and the private story don't match. And you as a DEI practitioner know that and are holding that. So that creates a tension in your own heart. I want you to think about that, okay? And then I want you to think about, and this is the fourth and last thing that I want you to consider, and that is the newness of the role and the culture you're working in. So I recently read an article in the Wall Street Journal called "The Demand for Chief Diversity Officer is High, so is the turnover." And one of the article's conclusions that stood out to me was that the Chief Diversity Officer role often has the smallest departments. They're often the least resourced from a budget and staffing perspective, yet they're responsible for both influencing and creating wholesale systemic change. So that's a quote from the article. I'll say it one more time. Chief diversity officers often have the smallest departments. They're often the least resourced from a budget and staffing perspective, yet they're responsible for both influencing and creating wholesale systemic change. The other thing the article notes is that 63% of diversity chiefs at S&P 500 companies have been in their roles within the last 3 years. So what that means is these are relatively new roles, but they're responsible for working in existing systems and are responsible for managing or leading large-scale change. And so that is a whole lot to hold when you are working from a space of frustration, when you consider the opportunity cost, when you are thinking about this tension that you may be holding in your heart, and when you're working in a space that doesn't have a supportive structure to support the aspiration around change and to support you in your role. So that's a lot. While we have this little break, I want to invite you to check out my blog, also called Race in the Workplace, at raceatwork.com. There you will find so much goodness. I always share practical how-tos and racial equity best practices, all written for DEI leaders inside organizations. Check it out. All right, so now that we have named what the challenges are, what the reality is of the roles that you may be in, I want you to think about a couple of other things. I'm all about offering practical, actionable suggestions, and so here are some things that you can do. First, I want you to know that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't. I want you to slow down. I want you to pause, and I want you to reflect. Slow down in your work, pause, and I want you to reflect. And I want you to reflect on those 4 things that I just talked about. Is any of that you? Does any of that I just mentioned, does that explain how you're feeling or situations you're confronting at work? So you need to think about that. Journal it. I'm a huge advocate of journaling in this space. When you're working in DEI, huge advocate of it. And think about that and journal your own thoughts and your own feelings about that. So slow down, pause, reflect. Decide how much are you willing to give to this role, to this organization? And this is internal to you. No one can decide this but you, and write it down. Determine what your line is. This is the third thing. Determine what your line is. What is your point of no? What is the point that you say, you know what? I'm not doing this anymore. It's time for me to move on. And you're the only person that can decide that. Okay. I want you to remember a really important thing. That change that one organization will reject, another one will embrace readily and with vigor. One of my favorite quotes that guides my work is from an organization called Children's Alliance in Washington State. And it says, "We recognize that a commitment to becoming a multicultural, inclusive, and racially equitable organization is not the same as actually becoming one." And I love that. And I love that because it's so true. There's a difference between making a commitment and becoming what you've stated that commitment to be. There's a difference in the becoming and the committing. And I love that. And there's a huge difference in making this commitment to becoming different in some way or unbecoming who you were as an organization, to live into your equity commitment. There's a difference between making that commitment and actually becoming that organization. And there is a need often to dig into really hard stuff and actually doing the work to become. And I find that many organizations get stuck in the gap between their commitment and the action to actually become that organization. So I've committed in my own work to recognizing that better, to be sharper and quicker in recognizing when that gap is there. And I think it's also recognizing, at least for me, my own limitations in terms of understanding that I, as one person, even though I might be right, that I can't force an organization to make any kind of change that they don't want to change, that I don't have enough courage for us both, and that's okay. I need to recognize that, but then that requires a shift for me. Maybe that's not a space for me. And I think for me, that's been really eye-opening. So I hope that helps you. So when I first started in this space, I didn't know that I could say no. I had no clue about work boundaries. I was all in all the time. I have a whole other career in public policy, which is why I always call myself a reluctant consultant. I now know that my journey started in very much the same way other Black women have experienced DEI work. It was an added responsibility to work that I was already responsible for. But that's another topic. So I want to take this moment to be very clear that I appreciate the opportunities that my work has opened for me, the places I've traveled, the people I've worked with. But what I'm naming and talking to you about this today now is how that process started. And for me, it worked out, but that's not everyone's story. And that's not everyone's experience. And that's also okay. So I'll say again, stop the fight. Pause. Then assess and reassess your struggle. And why are you struggling? I think that it's helped me so much to take advantage of the opportunity for reflection. That pause can mean so much. It can give so much. So if you are fighting and convincing and shaming and cajoling, whatever it is that you're doing right now, I definitely connect to being in that space. Trust me. We are in motion. We're constantly moving. There's a need and a space for the quiet and the calm that comes in that pause. So I'm going to ask you to take advantage of that and take that moment in the pause to reflect. I think in the pause, it's really important to get clear on your why. I think we all have a personal why in this work. And I think that those pause moments are opportunities to get really clear on your personal why and get really clear on if that particular fight, the one that you just paused from, is that connected to your purpose? And if so, how? And then ask yourself, is it necessary? Is it helpful? And I think that moment of getting clear will help you determine the answer to those questions. Is this a fight worth being in, or is this something you can let go? And the other thing that I want to leave you with as I wrap up today, I say this to folks who are new in the work. And when I mean new, I mean 5 years or less, that decide how much of yourself that you're going to pour into this role, that you're going to pour into this organization that you're working in, that you're going to pour into that nonprofit, into that philanthropy, into that corporate space. How much of yourself are you willing to give? How much? How much of your talent, how much of your goodness are you going to pour out? And decide that up front as best you can. And then once you've decided that, protect the rest of yourself. Protect the rest of your goodness, your peace, your talent, your sleep, your joy. Protect those things. Because every role that we're in doesn't require us to pour out all of ourselves. And I think that's so important, and not enough of us practice that. So thank you for joining me today. I look forward to sharing more. And remember, if you are fighting, stop, pause, and assess if the fight you're in is truly your struggle. Take the best of care, and until next time. That's this week's episode of Race in the Workplace. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, and share it with a friend who may be a DEI professional who can use these strategies in their work. My hope for the podcast is that it reaches every person who needs it. Until next time, take care. This is episode 001 of the Race in the Workplace podcast. You can find show notes and all of the resources that I mentioned in the episode on my website at stameystreet.com/episode 001. That's stameystreet.com/episode 001.